Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first webinar of 2026. How did it get to 2026? It seems like yesterday it was the year 2000, but anyway, you blink and we're here. So, but thank you very much for all giving up your time this evening. Tonight we have two of the PRISM partners speaking, which is Jude and Michael. So Professor Jude Capper, which I'm sure you'll all know, but I'll give you a brief background in case you don't, is from Harper Adams University. She is the ABP Chair of Beef and Sheep Production. And Jude has spent many years of her life looking and assessing the environmental impacts and sustainability of livestock production systems using the expertise from her PhD in ruminant nutrition and behaviour. Jude has done all of the Harper reports. I know there's still a few to come out, but these should hopefully be finished by the end of the month. So, and Jude will talk through those elements on that tonight and be able to answer other questions. And then Michael Haverty is from the Anderson Centre. He is a partner and a senior research consultant there. He has organised the assessors which have gone out to England, Wales and Scotland to do the assessments, obviously quite a lot were done over the phone. Michael comes from a livestock farming background in Ireland, and he's led numerous projects focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impacts on farming. So they are both very well they've got great knowledge and hopefully we'll be able to answer questions this evening. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, I think, first, Michael.
Yes, thank you very much, Katie.
If anyone has got a question which is really pertinent to the slide or, or whatever that we're talking about, then do use the raise a hand function or pop it in the chat. Or if you've got one that we'll bring up a bit later, if you don't want to forget it, obviously pop it in the chat and then we'll do majority of the questions at the end in case we get, we might have been coming on to that anyway. But I'll hand over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Katie. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you. So just got a few slides just to give an outline of the proceedings for this evening, and then I'll be going into some PDF files similar to the reports that you have received already. So just in terms of an overview of the agenda, I'll be firstly giving an overview of the AgriCalc Whole Farm report. Linked with that, the Anderson summary report, which farms based in GB will have received. I'll give an overview of that using an example farm. I'll then hand across to Jude, who will give a summary of the Harper Adams reports and some key insights from that. And as we go through, we'll address questions where we can. Got a few key takeaways at the end as well. And of course, further Q&A at the end also. So that's just an overview. I'm just going to switch programs here and just going to go into the PDF of the AgriCalc Whole Farm report. So you can see hopefully coming up on your screens here, just an example report that we have taken from one of the PRISM farms. You will all have received a report similar to this. And I'm just going to go down through. I'm not going to go into detail on every key aspect of the report. It is quite detailed. Some of that information is useful as background. But I think just a couple of key areas that I would focus on. I suppose firstly, in terms of the whole farm emissions, that is useful just to get an insight into which are your key enterprises that are contributing to the overall emissions on farm. You can see for this farm here, it's the beef one primarily, that finishing enterprise. And you also get a breakdown as well in terms of emissions by gas. So again, looking at the sources of your emissions, you can see grazing livestock farms. Most of you on this call will be well aware it is methane that is the key source of emissions. And there are additional insights provided in the report in terms of where the carbon dioxide is coming from, either directly from the enterprises that you have on farm or indirectly via those farming inputs that is used to produce your output. So some of that information, I'm not going to go into detail on it. It is useful and interesting when you have some opportunities to review the overall findings for your individual farm. But I think some of the key areas that I focus on when I go through the report is just, first of all, spending a few moments just looking at the product emissions table here, because that is quite important in terms of the measures that AgriCalc uses to assess emissions from your farm. Particularly, I would pay attention to the total output here. This is in kilos of dead weight equivalent for the beef enterprise. Important from an AgriCalc perspective to remember, it quantifies output using a sales less purchases approach over the period that is assessed. And that can be quite important at times when interpreting your overall on-farm emissions. And then from there, it's a similar breakdown that's given for the sheep enterprise, for the combinable crops. Those of you who would have those, that's then usually it's presented on a kilo of CO2 equivalent per ton of output in those cases. But worth just paying some attention, I would suggest, to that, to your emissions and how they break down before going through the remainder of the report. There are some mitigation areas that AgriCalc put forward. I think some of them, they are quite generic. They appear on a number of different reports, I would say. I think more important to look at the specifics in terms of what Jude would provide from the Harper Adams report, summary insights from the report that the Anderson Centre also compiles as well for those farms that are based in GB. I think from my point of view, though, the area that is of most interest is to look through the individual enterprise emissions. And here you can see the finishing of the dairy beef cross calves. That is the main enterprise that is at play. Some of your farms will have different enterprises. A couple of beef enterprises, for instance, it could have a suckler enterprise in addition to a finishing enterprise. But the overall enterprise results do have a similar layout. First of all, you get an overview in terms of the emissions by source. You can see here feed digestion. That tends to account for the majority of emissions, about 2/3 in most cases. Manure management, fertilizer also of importance, as are the purchase feed and bedding costs. And you can see fuel, electricity, generally a relatively small proportion of overall emissions. And once again, you can see the emissions set out by gas as well. Methane, unsurprisingly, accounting for the majority, but worth considering the other two as well, particularly nitrous oxide linked with those fertilizer applications and other carbon dioxide emissions as well. And then there's comparisons are given, which I think are particularly of interest in the context of interpreting your PRISM reports. Here, looking at your individual farm enterprise against the comparison farms with similar types of enterprises based on the AgriCalc data set. So you can start to see in a visual graphical format here where how your farm is performing, where it's beating the benchmarks in some areas, perhaps in some farms where it is underperforming. I tend to focus a little bit more though on the tabular based emissions at a quick glance level. And here you can see the emissions set out by individual source. So again, that feed digestion, you can see about 2/3 of the overall emissions total. It gives a comparison then in terms of the similar type of enterprises based on the AgriCalc data set, and gives some insights then in terms of the opportunity level that might arise. If it's close to the average, generally seen as medium. If it's above the average, significantly above the average, then it's seen as a high potential opportunity area to start to reduce your emissions. And that does give some insights in terms of some of the areas that might be focused on where your farm can achieve those marginal improvements to start to reduce emissions over time. So I think that's a particularly important area to focus on when interpreting your AgriCalc reports. From there are some insights that are given as well in terms of physical performance. I think some of those are useful, particularly looking at areas like mortality rate, for instance. How does your enterprise compare against the industry average? And therefore, are there actions that could be taken around that to improve the herd health and therefore reduce the overall emissions? Live weight gain, another key one, particularly considering factors like age at slaughter, for instance, which has a significant bearing on whether a farm is considered to have higher emissions or lower emissions. And I think optimizing for that in particular is of importance. And there are a range of other factors that are given as well in terms of sale weights for the finished cattle in particular. That's important, and just how they compare with the overall average. It is interesting. I think arguably more of a focus I would suggest at times would need to be on how your finishing weights compare against the ABP spec, because of course ultimately that is also key in terms of the quality of the output and obviously the prices that you receive. So that's an overview in terms of the beef enterprise. This farm also has a store lambs enterprise. And you can see here again, similar breakdown. I'm not going to go through it area by area in terms of the emission sources. It is a similar structure to what you see for the beef enterprise overall. And again, you see the breakdown based on per kilo of product on a deadweight basis, as with the beef. This farm, particularly low emissions. It is a farm where there's a high turnover. Stock don't stay on there too long, so therefore the methane buildup in relation to the live weight gain is relatively low on this farm, so that does help in terms of the overall emissions. This farm as well, it's more of a focus on the beef enterprise, and therefore somewhat fewer inputs being used on the lamb enterprise as well. So there are factors in terms of the overall emissions. Once again, some figures are also given in terms of mortality. This is obviously a store lamb operation, so you don't see a lambing percentage set out here, and performing well in terms of issues like mortality, for instance, which again will contribute to lower emissions overall. So from my perspective, in terms of looking at the beef and sheep enterprises, I think there are some of the key areas to look at. There is some additional information given on the combinable crops that are also used here as well. I know several of you won't be focusing on these individual areas, so perhaps of less interest, but it does give some insights at a farm level in terms of some areas where there might be savings that could be made over the longer term. Then from an Anderson's perspective, in conjunction with those AgriCalc reports, which each of you will have received, you will also receive a report such as this. Important to highlight, those of you based in Northern Ireland, the structure is a little bit different there, so you will not have received reports such as this. But what we seek to do here is just to give a few insights into key areas that you can focus on as quick wins, where you can start to take action now to move the dial in terms of reducing emissions. So it's very much focusing on a few key areas where you can act on in the shorter term to achieve those marginal improvements. Because from our experience, it is a number of marginal improvements that build upon each other that move the dial in terms of overall emissions. And it is what separates the better performing farms from some of the more average performers. So here, based on this report, fuel usage, you'd have seen for the wheat enterprise, it was quite high. And overall, I think most farms can achieve marginal improvements here if they look for them. Looking at things like tire pressure, ensuring that there's no idling of machinery, for instance, is a key and important point. Just wondering.
It's just gone weird on the screen.
Yeah, I apologize for that. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here and come back in. Yeah, I thought I'd lost connection there for a moment, so apologies for that. Can you all see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, don't know what happened there. But another area we identified, as you'd have seen with the beef enterprise, mortality was a bit higher than the average as well. So again, another area for improvement. All of your farms in PRISM do undertake animal health and welfare reviews. So again, it's looking at that proactively and using that proactively as a means to identify areas where improvements could be made in terms of vaccination protocols, for instance, or just better ventilation. And those insights, again, can be just useful in getting more animals finished, getting more lambs weaned, for instance, in order to reduce emissions overall. And then there's a range of different areas. Certainly genetic improvement is something that can be looked at as we move into the future. And I think this is an area where there will be more of a focus in longer term. So it's again just looking at opportunities around that to monitor health, to look at activity levels, what behaviors, what genetic traits are associated with lower emissions. So there are some examples of the performance improvement opportunities, just based on one example from this farm. I will come back in later on just to give a summary from some of the key actions that we've seen across PRISM overall, just in terms of key areas across all farms that we should be focusing on. But perhaps, Jude, if it's okay, I might just stop sharing and hand over to you just to go through the Harper Adams reports.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Michael. I apologise. I know I sound remarkably like a Dalek, and there's a fly in here. I don't know why, but I've got the normal Christmas cold, and I can't even blame my daughter since it's been summer holidays. So happy days. Right, so I am going to show you an anonymised Harper Adams report, although this, not surprisingly, is for the same farm that Michael showed you earlier, so that we've got some consistency. So you're not thinking, why is it suddenly showing, suckler cows and horses when it should be showing beef and sheep? And obviously, when we looked at putting together the Harper reports, we were looking at a combination of your AgriCalc reports and also the Excel key performance indicator sheets, because particularly when we first started the projects, we didn't exactly know what data we were going to get as an output from AgriCalc. And obviously we couldn't get the whole databases, all of the data from AgriCalc, until after all of the farms had been completed. So particularly for the early farms, you wanted excuse me, we wanted to gather some of the other key performance indicator data, which would again give us some insights into efficiency. Because as you'll have seen in the AgriCalc report, there are some comparisons to what other farms that are similar to you do, but it's a relatively short list. For beef and sheep, it's only about 8 to 10 parameters. If it makes you feel any better, for poultry, it goes down to about 4 or 5. So there's very little to look at. But of course, and this was a question that was asked, I think, by email or phone to Katie earlier this week, when we look at carbon footprint, we're not just doing that because of the environment. We're not just trying to be green. There is a clear linkage between efficiency, productivity, and carbon footprint. So anything that any of us do on farm to get those incremental gains, to get those positives coming out of it, is going to have a really positive impact. So obviously we're into phase 2 now versus phase 1. The vast majority of you will have had your phase 2 reports. Apologies to any that we haven't got to yet, but they will be coming out, as Katie said, in the next few weeks. And you'll have seen that at the start, we've got a comparison of your farm in phase 2 compared to your farm in phase 1. And this isn't a trick or a let's see what you've done over the last couple of years. It is just to see how people have changed. But I think it's really, really, really important to understand that when we look at carbon footprints, whether we're doing it with AgriCalc or Farm Carbon Toolkit or Cool Farm Tool or Trinity AgTech or any of the multiple calculators, I think it's valid to say that agriculture is the sector or the industry that is at most risk of change from outside, over which we have no control. So you just need to look at the weather, animal health, markets, economics, fertilizer prices. I'm sure we can all think about how the fertilizer prices shot up about 2 to 3 years ago, and all of a sudden people weren't using fertilizer, which of course had an impact on carbon footprint. So in a nice ideal world, all of our decisions that we make day to day would be very data driven, very practical, very affected by science and common sense. But in the real world, we may plan to harvest on Tuesday, but we can't do it till Thursday because the contractor isn't available. Or we may plan to get all the ewes in on a week on Sunday, but actually it's raining or it's snowing or whatever might be happening. So just be aware that even if you think you've made a lot of changes, or even if you think you've done some really good things that should have brought your carbon footprint up or down over that time, bear in mind that there are so many other factors out there that have such a big impact. It's really difficult to have a really controlled system within farming. And there were a few farms within the 350 or so that we've looked at that had a very similar carbon footprint in round 1 and round 2, but it was very few. You know, most people went up or went down. And in fact, on the beef side, most people, as an average, the footprint actually came down. But as I say, if we use this farm as an example, so they had a dairy beef finishing operation and a store lamb operation. And you can see between round one, see if I can highlight this. There we go, look at that. Between round one and round two, their carbon footprint came down from 20.5 to 13.4, so a 35% decrease. And that was primarily because their output went up by 50%. So anything you do to increase output is always going to have a big effect, because if you think about your carbon footprint, it's your total emissions over your total output. So output is really, really key. Productivity is really, really key. So the total emissions hardly changed at all on beef. They were very, very similar between the 2 years, but because of that 50% increase in output, the carbon footprint came down by 35%. And it's really important to highlight, and it's at all the bottom of your tables here, output isn't just the beef that you sold or the lamb that you sold, you know. So Agricult calculates it at the moment as the dead weight equivalent of your total sales minus your total purchases. So you might have sold a heck of a lot of cattle, but if you also bought a lot of cattle, your net output isn't going to be that high. Do you see what I mean? So you've got to think about that output figure. This figure here is not necessarily going to be the same as the figure you get if you added up all the animals that you've sold, because it takes into account those purchases as well. And if we look at the store lamb operation, in the first year, it was pretty low, 7.7 kilos of carbon per kilo of dead weight. In the second year, it was incredibly low, 3.29. And I know this farm, and I know that between the first analysis and the second analysis, they did make some improvements in the time that they got those lambs off to slaughter. In the first year, they were quite heavy because they had a antibiotic withdrawal issue, I think it was, which meant they couldn't go to slaughter for a longer amount of time than planned. But even so, this is a really low carbon footprint. And when we look across the different sectors out there, and many of you will have seen the first and the second ABP PRISM reports, which Katie produced over the last couple of years, store lambs out of all the sheep enterprises do tend to have the lowest carbon footprints. But that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, because of course, if you've got a store lamb enterprise, you don't have to have any breeding ewes. So of course, you're going to have a lower carbon footprint there. Again, in this instance, lower carbon footprint primarily driven by that increase in output. So not a particularly high output, but in round one, 1,600 kilos of lamb dead weight compared to 3,000, so an 86% increase over those 2 years. But in this instance, they also had a decrease in the total emissions. So not only did they produce more total lamb output, but they did it with fewer total emissions. And that's the win-win that in an ideal world we'd all be able to achieve. But again, it's a bit like those adverts for investments you see, you know, stocks can go up or down. Carbon footprints do exactly the same, because in farming there are so many factors that we simply can't control. With the best will in the world, when we get the snowstorm that's going to be heading across Wales in the next 2 days, when we get an episode of blue tongue, for example, you know, things can go south very quickly in a way that we're not expecting. And I blanked out the text here, obviously, because I want to keep things anonymous. But then if we look at this year's carbon footprint, which Michael went over to some degree compared to the average, we can see that in this enterprise, again, 19% lower on the beef and 82% lower on the sheep. As I said, that 3.29 is very, very, very low. But next year it could be 23, or it could be 18, or it could be 6. In fact, so you never... the supposition or the suggestion that this number here could go down to 2 or 1 or 0 or minus, you know, it is possible. Now, I should note here that if anyone had minus numbers for their carbon footprint, that does not mean that you're carbon neutral, that you've won the carbon lottery, as it were. Because Agricalc works on output, net output, if your purchases are higher than your sales, you'll get a negative carbon footprint, because Agricalc can't compute the fact that you've bought more than you've sold. So if you've got a negative, you're going to have some messaging in this section over here to say we can't compare because your purchases outweigh your sales. And then, of course, you're going to have some recommendations based on that farm. Now, please be aware, and you know this already, of course, but I haven't been to every single farm. I can't get to every single farm, you know. If in an ideal world we'd have done this over, 10 years, and like I'd have gone to every farm, talked to every farmer, looked at every field, every sheep, every cow, etc. But we can't do that. So if I've said to you, your calving percentage is at 92%, for example, and I've said, could it be 100? Could it be 98, let's say? And you go, of course it can't. Don't be ridiculous. Bear in mind that when I see that 92, I've got no idea whether you're achieving a 92% calving percentage after a heck of a lot of work, and you've worked really hard over the last 10 years to pull it up from 82% in 2016 or so, or whether you're just sort of coasting along going 92 is fine, can't be bothered to change it, could probably make some really simple changes and get 95, 98, 99. Okay, so even when you're doing well, there's always little bits that we can change. And bear in mind, the better farmers, with, generally speaking, assuming no massive farm changes, good carbon footprints, those are more difficult to find things that are applicable and appropriate to change your carbon footprint. If you want to, if we have like a rugby example, I've got lots of rugby things on my desk. I can't see any of them now, interestingly. But if we've got a rugby example, hang on. Oh, I do have a rugby thing. Here we go. If you got my rugby mouse, that you may or may not be able to see. England, I'm afraid, not Ireland or anywhere else. But if we got a rugby example, it would be far easier, for example, to find some ways to improve the national women's rugby team for Hong Kong or for Germany. For example, Germany's about 22nd in the world at the moment, than it would for England, who are first in the world. Because the better you are as a rugby team or a farmer, the fewer things there are that we can pick at to improve, particularly when I haven't seen your actual farm. So if I've told you to improve your, age at first calving or your calving percentage, and you go, well, of course I can't do that, that's ridiculous, come back to us, tell us why you can't, give us some indications why, because we can only go on the data that we've got. We can't see everything on your farm. I'm going to stop talking now, primarily so I can cough, and we'll see if there's any questions, if that works. And of course, Katie and Michael, if there's anything you want to add, please feel free.
Thanks, Jude, and thanks, Michael. What I should have said at the start, which I told Michael and Jude I was going to, and I completely didn't, but Michael did allude to it a little bit, just to say why there was a difference between NI and GB. So a lot of the NI farmers had already had a carbon footprint with a CAFRE scheme at the start of PRISM. So instead of everybody redoing their carbon footprint all over again, because it was done with AgriCalc, that was just bought into the PRISM system. And that's why they haven't been following the same trend of an Anderson's consultant going out to all of those farms. And then that scheme seemed to come to an end. So we had to obviously do it slightly differently for phase 2. But that's why there is the difference there. And also just to remind everyone that it's a snapshot in time. It is a 12-month period, and not everybody chose the same 12-month period as well. So it really is about comparing your farm, and if your sales aren't regular and continuous through that year, as Jude said in the calculations, it might mean that the output's different there as well. So there was a question Thomas asked Jude about, and Michael has put an answer in the chat about his AgriCalc average is different to the report that you were sharing. And Michael said there could be a couple of factors, because obviously the average moves all the time depending how many more farms are added and validated for those systems. So I'm hoping, Thomas, the average isn't, because if yours is a finishing enterprise as well, I'd like to hope the average isn't too much different to what was on the screen. But just we can I can contact you or let us know if it is much different, but it shouldn't be too far out. It's just because there's different ones being validated all the time, so more farms being added into the system.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I'm happy with that. I guess for me, it's been a learning journey. It's been very useful. And even as it stands with my report, I can say it's not right today, but that's not anybody on screen's fault. It's all about me making sure the garbage in was correct. Because if the garbage in's not right, the garbage coming back out will definitely not be right. So yeah, I can see where there's been some anomalies with the data I've provided. Well, let's put it this way, I haven't been clear enough, and I guess that's a part of understanding piece, but it's been really useful, so thank you.
And
Excellent.
linking with that, Thomas, I know it's not easy and simple to pull the data together to what you need to put in there. We are just trying to look at our Bromstead farm and do the next year, and we're trying to pull the data without a consultant to just see, because AgriCalc tool should be able to be used. It is available for farmers to input their own data. So we're trying to see how we can put our data in. I think we'll end up needing to get one of Michael's guys to help us at the end to just make sure we're obviously putting it all in the right places. And we're doing that with being able to look at what was inputted for the previous year.
Yeah.
And so we can almost see, well, if our figure's too far out, we know we're doing something wrong. Whereas, if people are just coming in it from the start, or if you think some of your figures are already wrong in there, it is really tricky to know what to put in there and how to gather the data and record the data through the year as well. I think some people have found when they've done it once, they know what they need to be recording in a different way to make it easier to then input the data either to a consultant or, into a system.
Yeah, the simple one in my case was fertilizer application. So it's same enterprise as what you had on screen, Jude. So it's finishing beef and finishing sheep, store lambs. But there has been fertilizer allocated to the store lambs, which I don't remember ever saying, which wouldn't be right because they're bought in January and off farm in February. They're very, very short turnaround.
Yeah.
But that's my fault, I guess, for not having asked how it was going to be apportioned.
Yeah. And to be fair as well, and almost all of you, I think, were in phase 1 and phase 2 because AgriCalc completely changed their whole input and output thing between round 1 and phase 1 and phase 2. So those of you with more than one beef or sheep enterprise, and in the entire population, I think there is we've got some people with 3 different beef enterprises on farm, and we've got some with 3 different sheep. I don't think we've got any with more than 4 combined, but so of course in the first year it was just beef and sheep, and now it's, for example, store lambs and a hill flock and a finishing dairy beef enterprise and a suckler cow enterprise. So even for people who were in phase 1, in phase 2 you were being asked to allocate between enterprises in a way that you weren't being asked in the first year. And of course we didn't know that was going to happen, and obviously we'd have preferred that it was consistent between year 1 and 2, and that's why if you went back to look at your first year report, you'd see your carbon footprint was different again, because your carbon footprint in this later report, when we compare year 1 to year 2, is under the new system. But they can't back calculate to take your beef answer from year 1 and to make it a dairy beef and a rearing heifers enterprise, for example, for year 2. So it's AgriCalc. I still think AgriCalc is the best tool, but it is very much a case of making sure you've put the right data in, and if you can, thinking about it over the year rather than going, oh my goodness, I need to do that tomorrow. Now I say that I've still got to do my self-assessment tax, and I've only got whatever it is, 24 days left, and I am going to do it before the 31st, but I haven't thought about it till now, I've got to admit. So I'm possibly a bad example. Just to come back on the AgriCalc average, yeah, Katie and Michael are absolutely right. Over time, they do change. And the farm that I showed you was one of the first ones to be done in phase 2. And when we were recording the results as they came in the Excel sheet, we could see as time went on, that average would change up or down. The other thing that does very occasionally happen, I've been working on a different project, and one of the guys on it has organic Wagyu cattle. And AgriCalc used to show on your report how many other farms you were being compared to, and I think it's taken it out now, which is interesting, because in the organic Wagyus, I was like, I don't think there are any others this is actually being compared to, because all the farms numbers are exactly the same as the benchmark numbers, you know. So in some situations you may be compared to like 2,500 farms or to 23 if you're something a bit more niche. So it isn't a consistent pool, but it is farms similar to you. Now, the only thing that I would say in addition, and you might know the answer to this, Michael, do you know whether there was any regional basis in the similarity or not? Because I don't remember. It's a simple answer.
Yeah, I don't think so, Jude. I know back in the phase one of PRISM, some put forward the view, AgriCalc, because of where it's based and a bit more Scottish focused, tend to be reflected in the overall average results. But again, that was very much, the overall average within AgriCalc.
Yeah.
I know there was an ambition to do more at one stage, but I think just moving from one methodology to the other has already taken a lot of time, so they haven't got there as far as I'm aware. So, yeah, if I could just add one final point, I think, in terms of these emissions, it reminds me, I suppose, of, measuring GDP in economic terms. It's a measure that's been around for a while. It has evolved a lot. And looking at emissions is at an early stage. I think it's important, though, not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And although AgriCalc as a tool has its it's not perfect. No tool is. I still think you can make improvements, based on what's reported now. And that's the important thing to focus on.
So one of the other questions I was asked in the week, and I think Adrian is on the call, he'd asked that, do you think the new rules in Scotland coming in will mean that with the suckler cow payment, will mean that the number of calf deaths will increase because within AgriCalc, because obviously people will need to record it for the number of days calved?
I mean, I can just say yes and leave it at that, can't I? Yeah, undoubtedly. If your payment depends on being able to prove your calving interval, you're suddenly going to have to start saying, yes, I had a calf that died within 2 days or was stillborn, or etc., etc. And I think that things will get registered far quicker if there were any registration issues as well. So yeah, the sort of often quoted, depending on your source, 80 to 90% calving percentage might not be quite so high next year and the year after, I think.
Has anybody else got some questions? Sorry, Michael, carry on.
No, I just said I agreed with Jude's perspective on it there. Yeah, these anomalies will spring up as a result of the rules.
Okay.
See, Adrian, you have your hand up.
2 quick things. There is a comparison on your report, but there's no benchmarking. So you don't know if you're good, middle, or bad. You just know that you're compared to.
Yep.
Is that going to change? Because being average is not really where people are aiming at. And the second question is around GWP. Is AgriCalc going to move to GWP star, and will that make big differences?
I think I probably take the second part of that first, Adrian. AgriCalc, even in this version, has a GWP star element to it. I think it's very high level, though. And I'd be very cautious in interpreting it. And I think at an individual farm level, if your farm size has increased significantly over the past 20 years, then your GWP star figures are not going to look that good. Whilst at a national level, livestock populations stagnant to going down. If you looked at a national level GWP star, it to be a more positive picture. So I think important to bear in mind, I think that anomaly, in the context of looking at GWP star. I still think both GWP star and GWP 100 need to be focused on, albeit there is imperfections with the GWP 100 measure as well.
And just to add to that, we were looking at, because it is in there in your AgriCalc report. It's like buried on like line 4 of table 5 on page 6 or something like that. So it's not there as a big bold number. It's like buried on about the 4th page. But we've got a postdoc working on this, and she actually started tabulating the GWP star figures as well, just to see whether we could see trends. Because as I say, if we look at beef, for example, on average, beef has come down over the 2 years between year 1 and year 2. But the GWP star figures are all over the place. There is no nice consistent trend with here's the 100, say, here's the GW star. They are completely all over the place now. And Michael may know this better than me. As I understand it, because I have a colleague who asked AgriCalc, as I understand it, to work out the GWP star figures, they asked the farmer, what were you doing 20 years ago? But I don't think they did that in great and lengthy detail from AgriCalc. I think it was just, how were you 20 years ago? And that was it. So it's a very rough and ready calculation at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Jude. I think it was how many cattle had you on farm 20 years ago, and obviously, the balance of those cattle between young and old, etc., could have changed significantly within that time as well. So we're at the very early stages. It's very crude. I'd be very cautious in interpreting it in much detail. I think your other question, Adrian, was just around, you're being compared to an average, and what about the benchmarking? Yes, I'd agree. In an ideal world, it's what are the best performing 25% doing, and how do you get towards that? I think that would be useful, certainly to have. I think we're not there yet. I think AgriCalc, it took a lot of bandwidth for them just to get migrated across to this new version. But I think an improvement like that would certainly be useful over time.
And just to add to both of those questions, actually, on the asking what you were doing 20 years ago as well, of course, bear in mind, you might say 20 years ago I had 10 cattle, but your farm now might have been 5 farms 20 years ago as well. And so you wouldn't have factored in necessarily that my farm actually had 120 cattle and now I have 8 cattle, let's say. So as I say, the question isn't being asked in necessarily the most robust way. On the ranking of farm, and I think we had a debate about this, didn't we, up in Scotland this year? Yes, that is coming. Once we've got all the farms, well, we do have all the farm data now, and we can identify the best and the worst. The problem is that it is skewed because, of course, if you've got rid of 90% of your herd this year, you're going to look like you've got a really good carbon footprint. And if you've sold almost nothing because you've just expanded hugely, you're going to look like you've got a rubbish carbon footprint for this year. So to benchmark in the PRISM population is quite difficult. But James McCocken, who's one of the researchers working on PRISM, has done some really interesting stuff looking at some of the sort of top 5% versus the bottom 5% farms, assuming or adjusting it so that they don't have variation in the output over time. And so then looking at what are the factors on those farms which make them have a better or worse carbon footprint. And off the top of my head, I'm not going to try and quote all the factors because I'll get them wrong, frankly, but it isn't unexpected things. There are no magical bullets where if you only buy red ear tags, everything's great. It is mortality, it's growth rate. It's one of the really interesting ones, actually, and I have to be careful about how I talk about this because it can be less or more popular, is time spent on farm. So you would think that time spent on farm being lower would be good because the animals would be finishing faster. But actually what he found was time spent on a well-managed farm, i.e. good nutrition, good mortality, good health, etc., was actually more important. So if you think about it the other way around, that's like fewer moves is a positive thing. So if an animal goes from farm A to farm B to farm C to farm D and then is slaughtered, that's less good than being on the one farm all the way through. obviously not a positive thing to say to people who run markets, for example, because it doesn't make for a good news story. But I'm sure if it hasn't already been covered, some of James's work is going to be covered in one of the upcoming reports, I think. So there'll be more on that very soon. And that should address some of those benchmarking questions.
Yeah, James's report has been looking at the top, middle, and bottom, basically, and what affects those changes. And so there should be some more in that in the third report, which will be coming out hopefully by May time. Dowie, you had your hand up, but you've taken it down again. Does that mean we've answered your question?
Yeah, Jude covered most of that in that last point about time on farm. Thank you.
Has anybody else got any other questions? Or have we stunned you all to silence? I can't believe no one else has got any questions. Crosby, you always have a question.
Sorry, all I was going to say, Katie, is I think this has been really useful, and even for me this evening, the way you've been talking about the different enterprises, Jude. So, for example, on my farm, it is a continental finishing system plus dairy crossbed finishing system. I have both, but I only have one matrix in my reports. So I need to work on that. Again, it's again about the data in. It's the same thing.
Claire. You just unmute yourself, Claire. You're on mute.
Just a similar point on what Thomas said. We finish our young bulls, we keep our bulls complete. And I feel that is a complete system in itself compared to the heifers and the store cattle steers we buy in. It'd be interesting to see that metric, because that also goes into time on farm, with them have to be killed before 16 months. And I know ABP take quite a lot of young bulls, so I don't know. It would be an interesting, an interesting thing to see the difference in the young bulls compared to your standard store cattle, heifers, steers. I don't know if any data's been done on that, but to me that's quite fascinating, really.
I think James did pull something out on that, and don't quote me, but I'm almost certain they would have been lower than the average store, simply again because they grow faster growth rate, faster time on farm. There is, we often get a perception, well, if they grow faster then they need more feed, which of course they do, but it doesn't necessarily translate into higher emissions, because on a per day basis the maintenance cost of the animal is going to outweigh the increased emissions cost of the feed. So yes, they will need more feed, but it doesn't automatically feed in to the sort of classic, pumped full of grain, etc., must have a high carbon footprint. As you'll have seen from most of your reports, feed as a source as opposed to feed digestion in your tables, which is made up of lots of different factors, including animal performance, but the actual production and use of feed is a relatively small part of beef. So yeah, I would put quite a high amount of money on it that the young bulls would be considerably lower, but I don't have the data right in front of me to be able to quote numbers at you.
Okay, thank you.
Crosby.
Yeah, thanks. You've spurred me on. Michael, I think we maybe discussed this before, but the figures that we're coming forward with now, will these be used against us? Will these be used to destock? Will this be used? You know where I'm coming from here. And the other thing too, the figures that I've been getting over the few years is very much weather related. If you have got a lot of well, if you're lacking grass, you're going to be using meal. Sometimes it takes more to finish them. The figures are going to change so a lot. So it is dependent on that. The trust I have in this isn't massive, because if somebody goes by our figures, who's going to check how much diesel I used? Who's going to check the fertilizer used? Who's going to, is it up to ourselves? Or I'm sorry to be, oops, typical me, Kate, but if I do a figure this year that I can make sure I can beat next year, is that possible? Because I'm putting the figures in. Sorry, it's just, it's going to be asked by other people.
Yeah, no, and someone said to me right at the start, before when we were recruiting, they said, oh, well, I've been doing lots of things already on my farm, so do I just give all the figures from like a few years ago?
Yeah.
And no, you need to obviously be putting the figures that you are, because you can only compare yourself against yourself, and you only compare year on year. But what's really important is actually, you're not always going to be going down. You might go up. Yeah. It's not going to be a straight downwards line. That it will be a bumpy ride, because, as you say, the weather changes things. Jude mentioned about fertilizer, and when we were in round one, the fertilizer use was so low because of the Ukraine war. We thought, well, the carbon footprints are probably going to be lower in round one than they are in round two, because everyone will have had a more normal year for when we've reassessed in round two of fertilizer, and therefore that could rapidly increase people's carbon footprint. So we understand that nothing is always going to be the same, and farms will go up and down. Yes, we hope from changes that you're implementing that will help, obviously, with your efficiencies and help your carbon footprint, but there will be anomalies that will come in, and things that will, there could be a disease that hits, that a really bad year of pneumonia, and that could really knock the figures and knock what the figures are showing. But yeah, it's not all going to be in one direction.
Yeah, I'd agree, Katie, on that. It's like global temperatures, they're not all smoothly in one direction either, but the overall trend is clear. You get an El Nino, La Nina one year to the next, that has an impact too. So yeah, definitely right, Crosby. Weather has a big impact. I think in terms of, what you put in, garbage in, garbage out, as Thomas had mentioned, good stuff in, good stuff out as well. And I think the old adage, if you can't measure it, you won't be able to manage it, let alone mitigate it, and eventually, market the produce as well. Because I think it is important to mention what's being done here can be a source of important competitive advantage in the future. And relating to your other point about, beef coming in from elsewhere, that will become increasingly important, I think, in terms of you're shown to be measuring your carbon footprint over a number of years. And I think the results from phase 2 show that it's going in the right direction, versus somewhere where emissions are either not measured at all, way higher, or coming from ground where 30 years ago there was forestry growing on it. And I think it's important to mention, yes, there's going to be those pushing from one side to the next, but I think pushing back against that, it is to say, well, you're focusing just on a national level here. What will happen is, if it goes down here, it will come from somewhere else because the demand is there. And overall, at a global level, you'll be in a much worse situation. I think that message needs to go across strongly.
Yeah, I am agreeing with you. I'm not against it, because I think the main thing is that we understand it, and we understand how to help things, and understand why things have changed. I'm all for that, but it's just the fears that they might be used against us.
And one of the things that, and this is still being looked at, but one of the really interesting things that's coming out of the results is that those farms which have made a change versus those farms that haven't made any changes, the answer's there in where the carbon footprint is. Yeah. It is clearly significantly lower if people have been making changes on farms. So, and which I know James, that was doing the analysis, was really surprised that was coming out, and there's further work to be done there on social science and looking into that further. But it's clear that those farms that are making changes, and that's could be little changes, could be lots of changes, we don't know. That's just people that have said they've made a change when they had their reports done. It's clear when you analyse those that have said yes versus those that said no, that there's a clear difference in the average carbon footprint of those farms, which is really interesting.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Crosby. Has anybody else got any other questions? Oh, Rob.
Evening. Yeah,
Hey,
I
Rob.
just wanted to say, like, I'm no great eco warrior, but the changes I've made, small changes I've made, have actually made this more efficient. So at the end of the day, it's made us more profitable. Well, hopefully more profitable. So yeah, I think that's at the end of the day, that's it's got to come down to the bottom line, isn't it? And that's what's made the difference, really. I think all these changes that we have made has made me measure certain aspects that I'd sort of hadn't had time or just hadn't thought about. It's made me concentrate the mind and yeah, certainly help the business, I think.
That's great to hear, Rob. That's what, well, you know, we can say that improving your carbon footprint will improve your efficiency and hopefully improve your bottom line as well. But it's nice to hear from farmers that, you know, it is actually, and as you say, they're only small tweaks that you've been doing, which is but making a difference, which is brilliant.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would agree. And I mean, I think it's always really important just to think about, think about that profitability, think about that business side of it, because, I could see it'd be tempting, oh, we'll use feed additive X or we'll change our breed completely. But if it's going to make a very small difference overall, does it make economic sense to do it? And I should add the caveat, of course. I mean, obviously we're talking about carbon footprint, but there are so many other factors as well, biodiversity, soil quality, soil health, water use, etc., etc. So even though we're just focusing on carbon here, I think it's really important to have that whole business profitability and whole business health, as it were, which should hopefully improve everything going forwards, including carbon.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, Jude, as well. I actually have a couple of other final slides I can probably share as well, just some other thoughts which actually chime well with what Rob has just mentioned in terms of, that productivity and performance element. So I'm just going to go back in here just momentarily. Apologies, bear with me. Just in terms of some key takeaways from an Anderson Centre perspective. And we'll come back to take more questions. This traditionally is the perception, productivity, profitability could also use there, and environmental performance, two different things, two mutually exclusive things. But I think what we've found increasingly over PRISM, but also other reviews that we do, is actually there's a high degree of a sweet spot there that align with both in terms of improving both your environmental footprint and your bottom line on farm. And we've just set out some key steps there, just based on, I suppose, the collective experience of going through all the farms that we've reviewed, some of the key areas that keep coming up again and again in terms of regular reseeding, getting the most out of your feeds in terms of that feed digestibility, looking at forage analysis. Jude has mentioned about age at slaughter, feed efficiency, looking at the condition of your soil. So in terms of nutrient usage, is the pH at the right level? That's certainly been mentioned a lot. Rotational grazing also coming out quite frequently as well, and certainly phase one, that was a key area of focus. And then some of the more marginal issues, fuel usage, as we alluded to earlier on, just changing a few things, reducing idling, that can add up to quite a significant amount over the course of the year, and has done for PRISM farms as well. And you can see a number of other different areas there, more precision type approach to fertilizer, using grass analysis as well, measuring your grass. Again, this is what has been done in the dairy sector in particular. Bringing some practices like that, I think, in as well is also important, in addition to looking at your herd and flock health. And I suppose just looking at improving performance more generally, and I think it's a theme that's been mentioned here a number of times this evening. We don't see there being a silver bullet that improves performance. I'm speaking here in a financial farm business consultancy context as much as an environmental emissions context. It's about doing a lot of things that little bit better. It's the same in a number of other different sectors as well. The Sky cycling team has been mentioned, just hundreds of marginal improvements add up to a lot over time. And I think in terms of management, you know, some might think they're not so good at it, or naturally good at it, but it is important to mention it can be a learned skill. Everyone can improve. And I think that's the key point. You know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Where you're at right now, improve upon that, and you will get better over time. And here, just setting out from previous studies we've done, just what do the best farms do? Certainly a clear business strategy shared with partners within the supply chain, very much what PRISM is about, I think is important in terms of tackling emissions, goal setting, budgets, timelines, the values, where you want to get to in a few years' time. Again, that is important in terms of just implementing the vision that you would have for your farm. And as Adrian mentioned, you know, comparing, benchmarking yourself with the best performers. We'd say not just within your sector as well, like look elsewhere. What are dairy enterprises doing? What are the intensive livestock doing as well? Can you get some insights from that can help? And of course, overhead costs always going to be key, and certainly a key differentiator between the best and worst performing farms at the moment. And we alluded to, you know, knowing your market, the ABP spec, meeting those specs. I think that can also help as well in terms of the price, obviously, but in terms of emissions in the future. And there's a few other different points there just around having that view of the big picture, good control of the details of the business as well, and being open to that change and innovation, and at the same time keeping discipline in terms of a strategy once you've decided to go after that approach. They're just some of the key areas I think that have emerged from our perspective over the course of PRISM and other projects as well. And I thought just worthwhile to share that with you, because I think it is important as you go from here onwards in terms of those next steps. Where do you go? What are some of the key areas that you have to focus on? And I think overall, you know, focus on the things that you can control. I think that is key. There's a lot of things happening globally, can get lost in it sometimes, but I think important to look at, well, what can I control right now? Focus on that, implement it, and I think you can move forward. So yeah, just wanted to share those points with you whilst I had a few moments.
Thanks, Michael. Just if anybody else got another burning question, then do put your hand up. Adrian.
With the rise of mycoplasma, blue tongue, Schmallenberg, etc., do you perceive people's carbon footprints numbers starting to rise because of a reduction in slaughter, an expansion of days to slaughter due to unforeseen diseases, if that makes sense?
Can't honestly say that we've seen it within this data set, although there have been, you'll remember in the KPI sheet we did ask about, you know, unexpected challenges, and we certainly saw some outbreaks of mycoplasma, well, all of them actually, thinking about it, but overall across the UK I would say yes, that would be expected. And actually that's one area where there's quite a lack of overall information, animal health, you know. So we know obviously that if animals die or if they perform less well, they take longer, they have a higher carbon footprint, you know, etc. But we have as a scientific, you know, community, I guess, relatively little information on the impacts of different diseases, particularly on different farms.
Mycoplasma up here, certainly with what I've been looking at and seen, will have increased days to slaughter by 30 to 40 days.
Yeah, it will definitely have an impact. I mean, that could be masked if you'd, you know, bought fewer cattle this year, for example. But yeah, it'll have an impact.
That's on rearer finishing.
Yeah. It'll have an impact. And you know, as I say, those are the things that are so difficult to control for, because you can try to have the best system, you know, use all the vaccines you can, have the good biosecurity, etc. But for beef and sheep, particularly in systems it's relatively more extensive, it is very difficult to control, you know, everything that comes across. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jude. Eric.
I think some very good points have been raised tonight, but Katie, you may have an awful lot of information up your sleeve. You will have the blade farming system where there's maybe genetics involved, where you're getting more discipline into the management of stock. And if I listen to Claire there on the bulls at under 16 months, which we have run on the farm as well, those animals where that information is available normally do much, much better and away months earlier. There is, as I see it, and I'm coming up to 83 years of age, but I've been involved in the poultry industry all my life. And during the 53 years that I worked in the poultry industry, the age through genetics dropped by 50%, from 75, 80 days down to about 33 days for the same weight of bird. And, you know, the feed efficiency becomes dramatically improved, you know, but there's standards were put in management, in ventilation. There's really very little of that in the beef industry. It needs discipline, it needs genetics, it needs much more, I think, financial support from the factories to help in a management structure and ventilation structure. And that can be done, and the government as well can play their role in supporting people that meet the standards that the factories place down. There's nobody in the poultry industry allowed to build their own houses. It has to meet the standards. Where's the standard in the beef unit? You have the blade system. Could we roll that out throughout the whole UK? And the people who are in that system get, I'm saying, hopefully, 20 or 30 pence more than the standard price. So the factories have got to do a marketing job here too. And what Michael was talking about, there will be imported beef coming in to Europe. We have to be able to sell the image of the UK beef industry. Why will people buy our beef if we don't have standards that we can sell? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And yeah, obviously we have got really good high standards within all of the countries that are involved within PRISM, and you know, people supplying us. What we've also got to remember is the number of breeds we've got and the number of breeds people are adding to that daily with crosses. If only it was a simple system. I often link back to, I think New Zealand have got 6 breeds of sheep that they that people use in New Zealand, whereas how many breeds of cattle and sheep have we got here? We like to complicate things, I think. And I know from my days at AHDB, I was still saying, and we still are now, saying the same message about people using EBVs that I was saying probably 20 years ago. And yet there's still lots of people that still think EBVs are, you know, aren't worth looking at. And we have lots of data, we have lots of metrics. It's about people using the relevant data to help their farms and make the right choices to help and improve their systems. But generally, we haven't got, you know, there's more and more technology coming on board for beef and sheep farms, but it's not as it's not up there with the poultry side of things, of having everything integrated and everything on a line. But you know, I'm not sure anyone, if you told every farm that they had to have a certain breed, I think there'd be well, I'm not quite sure what would happen. There'd be riots everywhere. So I don't think, you know, or if we said you have to produce your grass, your silage in a certain way, I don't think that would quite work with beef and sheep farmers as it does in the poultry industry. But all we can do is try and help drive the messages. And obviously the farmers that want to pick up those messages will pick them up and move things forward with them, I think. Jude, have you got, or Michael, have you got anything to add?
I was just going to add that if you'd want to talk beef genetics and the role of those in improving sustainability, there was I can't remember who said it, but one of the people speaking on the panel at the City Meats lecture back a couple of months ago now, held at the Butchers Hall in London, claimed that the beef industry had made no progress in genetics over the past, 50 or so years. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine who many of you know, Ben Harmon. He's the chair of the National Beef Association, and he's also the chair of the Beef Genetics Advisory Forum. And I've never seen him quite so twitchy as when this was said, and he jumped up and had a big, tirade. So yeah, talk to Ben. Ben will absolutely talk your ear off about how much we have and can do in genetics. But of course, it is also a 2-year process, isn't it, almost? I mean, if we have a heifer tomorrow, by the time she gets to calving, hopefully it's 24 months. In poultry, it is a much shorter interval, so we can make a lot more fast progress very, very quickly. But yeah, talk to Ben. He'll talk to you for hours on that one.
Yeah, and I'm sure we've all seen I know we've got it from Bromstead. There are animals with faster growing genetics and better feed utilization, and there is exactly the same breed with much slower growing genetics and much poorer feed utilization. So we've got the data, and that has been talked about a lot, but it doesn't mean that everything's going to be taken up and acted on.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, and actually, I would just add as well, because I've just thought about it, one of my colleagues, Sarah Morgan, in conjunction with researchers at SRUC and various of the other institutions, is involved with the Breed for Change programme in sheep. So she's actively looking at methane emissions from different breeds of ewe and seeing how much variation there is between and within breeds. And we often talk about the fact that there's more variation within a breed than between breeds, but that project, which is going on, I think it's a 3-year project, it's looking at a heck of a lot of ewes, will actually give us some real insights into how we can breed more efficiently on the sheep side as well, which I think would be really good.
Thanks, Jude. Eric, was that an old hand, or is your hand still up?
My hands would like to ask another question.
Okay.
Remember that the poultry industry was in the same position 50 years ago as the beef industry is today. There were all types of breeds. You had the Rhode Island Reds, the White Leghorns, the Light Sussex, etc., etc., etc. And, that was all driven, that changed by the processor. And there used to be 13 or 14 processing plants, even in Northern Ireland. And that's down to a couple of processing plants today. And it's the same story in Scotland, it's the same story in England. It's driving what the retailer and the consumer wants. They want safe food. They want it as, like the chicken industry today, half the price of beef, so they can afford to buy it. We have to drive change. And if we're not prepared to drive change, we'll end up with no beef industry. And that will affect farming all over the UK, because imported beef will come in and it'll be cheaper. And if nobody had driven, in fact, in Scotland at the moment, basically there are no processors left in the poultry industry. It's driven now by 2 or 3 companies in the UK. And this is working with retailers. I don't want to mention the first retailer that we worked with many, many years ago. They wanted change. They wanted to have a system that every farmer was basically working to, or a standard that they were working to. And I don't see that in the beef industry at all. Where do I go to see the ideal setup? Whether should it be bull beef? Michael has a pile of information, and Jude there. The information is there. We have a league table of performance with all the same feed, all the same performance, and all the same standards in housing and heating systems. There's a whole program all set out, but there's a difference in a standard unit of over £50,000 a year of net income in a standard unit, driven by people who forget to order the feed, forget to order the gas, or just not managing the way the top performers manage. And that has got to be driven by, is it the farmer or is it the factory? Who is going to discipline or manage the farmer to meet those high figures? And it's unbelievable, the difference between them. And all the same basic information. So it's somebody has to manage most of the farmers. But like, we don't have 5 farmers doing the same thing in Northern Ireland. Everybody believes their system is the best. And what Katie probably knows the number of farmers we have. You know, it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, within PRISM, there's it's very hard to compare 2 farms that are like for like. Every farm is different, and what they're doing on those farms is actually quite different. So it is a challenge. We know that. And I don't know. I know you brought this up a few times before now. And I will take it back to others again, but I'm not sure how much that will be. Even as I said before, just trying to make small changes on some farms is a challenge, not alone trying to change almost their whole system. I can't see that happening, but I will take it back. I will take the thoughts back again to others within ABP and chat that through with them. Michael and Jude, have you got any other things to add? Because I know Michael's going to be locked in his building if we don't let him go soon to get out of the office. The security will lock him in, and I'm not sure he wants to sleep in his chair tonight.
No, I don't have anything else to add, but it has been really nice to hear all the comments and thoughts and questions, because of course we can only improve this and any future programs by having those thoughts, by having those questions, so that's been really good. So thank you all for your contributions. It's really appreciated.
Yes, I'd echo Jude's sentiments as well. Thank you all for your attention. I suppose one final point to just make in terms of, the beef versus the poultry, poultry, controlled environments, beef, there's a range of different environments out there. And I think that's a key factor. Not downplaying, there are lessons that can be learned from poultry, for sure there are. Just need to adapt it to key systems within beef. And yeah, I won't go any further in terms of the various different systems. I'll leave it at that. Just want to thank you all for your attention and your time. And yeah, been great to be part of the PRISM program and working with you all.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys. And if anyone does think of a question that later on tonight, tomorrow, next week, then do send it through to me and I can speak to Jude or Michael and make sure we get those answered. So thanks again, everyone, for your time this evening. Next week is on beef VIA with Harry Appleby from the Owlsmere plant. So hopefully see you next week at 7 o'clock. All right, thanks, guys. Thanks for your evening.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers,
Bye-bye.
Michael. Thanks, Jude.
Thanks, Katie. Bye-bye.
Cheers all.
Bye.